Hello, I'm James Deary, and for my movement analysis presentation, I will be talking about the sport of wrestling, and more specifically, the penetration step, or the shot that occurs before many leg attacks in wrestling. The model I'll be using to show these movements will be myself from when I was in high school. So the first part of the video will be me showing myself doing a shot in a match, and I will just generally describe the muscle movements and the action that is occurring for the whole body. And then next I'll be specializing and talking about the extremity of the right leg, which is the lead leg. So for left leading people, they'll be more looking at the left leg, but for right-footed people like myself, it'll be the right leg. And then that will be the muscle or the joint, more specifically the tibiofemoral joint of the right leg. That's what we'll be looking at. And then finally, I'll do more like a practical, like practice situation. So I have a rubric for like an assessment of like a high school athlete performing the leg attack, and I'll analyze myself doing a penetration step in game or in a match, and then I'll grade myself for how well I did or how poorly I did. So this is a general description of the shot. I'll be showing a couple clips of me from high school. I'll be describing basically all the muscle movements and things that are going on with my body and how I'm performing each shot while in an actual match. So here we go. So to start, this is happening on the edge of the mat. And so typically the shot starts with the wrestler in their wrestling stance. So head up, knees slightly bent, elbows tucked in near the waist, which isn't happening right now just because I was hand fighting the person. Hands are ready to fight, which is exactly what I'm doing. Dominant foot typically is forward, or right now is being pushed back. Back arched, butt out, and chest pushed out. So as I begin my step right here, I do a level change. So I bring both my knees to approximately 90 degrees. And the leading foot takes a step forward and non-leading foot takes a step back. As I can progress, my leading foot, the knee flexes fully to the mat, and the foot applies pressure to help drive the back leg right here. It will help drive the back leg forward as I reach with my arms to attack the opponent's legs. So this is a different clip because the play from the last clip quickly got called dead out of bounds. So here's where we left off, with my knee fully flexed, my right foot driving into the mat to bring my left foot forward, and my arm reaching to attack my opponent's legs. As I bring my left foot forward, I then use that foot to apply pressure into the ground and to continue pressing forward until I bring my opponent to the ground, even though he's applying pressure. Throughout this entire process, it was a key for me to have my head up, like I do right here, so that I don't get buried into the mat, but I can continue driving and bring my opponent to the mat. And that is the general description of how to correctly perform a double leg takedown or a penetration step to lead to a leg attack. So the information I used to help me with making that general description were videos from East Bay via Jordan Burroughs and Adam Wheeler. I cited their videos in my hard copy work. So now I'll be talking in greater detail of the extremity of the right leg, and I'll be taking a closer look at the specific muscles and joints and bones used while completing a penetration step for the right leg. For the detailed description, I'll break it down into 3 different components using a video from Adam Wheeler as a model. And I'll break it down into 3 different components, which consist of the level change, the knee flexion down to the mat, and the knee extension with the foot pushing off of the mat. So here I'm going to describe the level change. So this movement occurs from the most proximal to the most distal joints that are involved. So the 3 joints that are involved are the acetabulofemoral joint, the tibiofemoral joint, and the talocrural joint. And so for the acetabulofemoral joint, you'll see, which is also known as the hip, hip flexion occurs, and the muscles that are involved, so we're looking at here, the muscles involved are the iliopsoas group, which concentrically contracts to perform the flexion, so that would be the agonist of the group. The synergists and the muscles also involved are the tensor fasciae latae, the rectus femoris, and the sartorius. And the antagonists, which are the muscles that extend or stretch out to allow the action to happen, are the hamstring muscle group, which consists of the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus, and as well as the gluteus maximus acts as an antagonist for this motion. So now I'll take a look at the tibiofemoral joint, or the knee, which helps in lowering the level and center of gravity during the level change. The primary movers are actually controlled by eccentric contraction of the quadriceps group, which consists of the rectus femoris, the vastus intermedius, the vastus lateralis, and the vastus medialis. And the reason why it's eccentric contraction is because the ground is as a resistance, since it's a closed chain movement of the right leg, since the foot is not leaving the ground here. And the other muscles that act as synergists include the hamstring group, the gracilis, which is on the inner thigh, and the popliteus, which is the primary flexor, which is around the back of the knee right here. And then the antagonist of this movement is the gastrocnemius. The final part of this movement will be the slight dorsiflexion of the talocrural joint, or the ankle. And this again is an eccentric contraction because the ground is acting as a resistance in a closed chain movement, since the foot is not leaving the ground. And the primary movement is controlled by eccentric contraction of the gastrocnemius and is synergistically aided by the tibialis anterior, the extensor digitorum longus, and the peroneus teredius. The antagonists of this movement are the soleus, the tibialis posterior, and the flexor digitorum longus. So now the second phase of the penetration step or shot movement will be the knee flexion to the mat, and this occurs with the knee fully driving and hitting the mat and getting to this position here with the knee on the mat and the left leg, or the non-leading leg, about to switch over and get to the front of the body. So unlike the first phase, this phase starts more distally at the talocrural joint, and it continues in dorsiflexion which will use the same muscles as listed before. It just goes more into a deeper dorsiflexion. And then next, the knee will flex further, which again will use the same muscles as mentioned. The biggest difference and the reason why the knee is allowed to flex this much is due to the extra leverage gained by the patella bone. So, according to a study done from Sports Biomechanics, as workload level increased, the patellofemoral compressive force increased with no effect on tibiofemoral forces. So what this is saying basically is that because the patella is accepting that extra force since it is providing extra leverage of the knee flexion, it doesn't cause as much stress on the overall tibiofemoral joint, and it's able to produce more force without any extra stress on that joint because of the patella. Final step of this phase includes the extension of the acetabulofemoral joint, which allows the knee to hit the ground, which sets up the next phase. So the primary movers or agonists of this will be the rectus femoris, which concentrically contracts to produce the extension of the hip, and then aiding in this will be the gluteus maximus and the hamstring group acting as synergists for this extension, and then the agonists of this group will be the sartorius and the iliopsoas muscles. The final phase includes the extension of the knee and the push off the mat after the as the wrestler is taking down their opponent. There's no physical opponent here, so it's hard to show completely, but this motion also occurs from most distal to proximal in movement, with the first movement being the flexion of the hallux and the phalanges, which is done by the flexor digitorum longus and the flexor hallucis longus, which concentrically contract to flex the toes and push off the mat. Then the talocrural joint, or the ankle, will plantar flex. And this motion is performed by the concentric flexion of the gastrocnemius. And then the synergists for this motion are the flexor digitorum longus, the flexor hallucis longus, the tibialis posterior, the proneus longus, and the proneus brevis, which aid in the plantar flexion of the ankle. Will be the tibiofemoral joint, and it will slightly extend. So we'll see here. And the extension is caused by concentric contraction of the rectus femoris, which are supported by the other muscles as the synergists, which are the quadriceps group, which are the vastus intermedius, the vastus lateralis, and the vastus medialis. And the antagonists of this slight knee extension will be the hamstring group, the gracilis, and the popliteus. In the last phase of the penetration step will be the hyperextension of the acetabulofemoral joint, and this allows the leg to be propelled back so that the toes can push off the mat and the wrestler can attack the opponent's legs. So the primary movement will be controlled by the eccentric contraction of the iliopsoas group, and the synergists of this action are the hamstring group and the gluteus maximus, and the primary antagonist of this movement are the muscles of the quadriceps group. Here's another look at the movement as a whole, the level change, the knee flexion, and then the knee extension pushing off the mat. All of the joints in this movement are acting as third-class levers, which help produce force, which eventually help the wrestler to complete their. So for this final part of the video, I've created a rubric which will help a high school coach assess the wrestler on different aspects of their penetration step to make sure they're fundamentally sound. And these different scoring aspects include the level change, the penetration step itself, making sure that the wrestler steps in between their opponent's legs, then the sweep of the back leg to the front, the level head, and then finally that they get the takedown on their opponent. So I'll look at 3 different clips of my highlights, and I will score myself on whether or not I did a good takedown or not. So here I'll show my first penetration step / takedown attempt. So as you can see, I am at a low level, so I'm going to give myself a point for a level change with my knees bent. Moving on, my initial step wasn't in between my opponent's legs, which is where you typically want it to, so I'm not going to give myself a point for that. However, my back left leg did sweep to the front of my body, so I will give myself a point for the sweep of the body. My head was down for the majority of the takedown, so I'm not going to give myself a point for that because my opponent did a good job of blocking me and stuffing my head down. However, I do take multiple penetration steps, and I did get my head up at the end, which eventually did help me give the takedown. So overall, I'm going to give myself a 3 out of 5 for this takedown. My second takedown attempt. I do perform a level change, however my foot was not really close to my opponent when I took my shot. So I'll give myself 1 point for level change. However, I'm not going to give myself a point for having my penetration step near my opponent's, or in between my opponent's legs. As I continue, I do sweep that left leg around to continue driving forward. So I'll give myself a point for the left leg sweep. And as you can see, I keep my head up while continuing to penetrate while my opponent was providing resistance. So I had to keep penetrating forward by taking multiple steps. And eventually I do get the takedown. So overall, I'll give myself a 4 out of 5 for this takedown. So here's my third takedown attempt that I'll be showing. So I do perform a level change here. And again, my foot wasn't really in between my opponent's legs. So I'll give myself a point for level change, but I won't give myself a point for the penetration step foot placement. This time, my leg doesn't really sweep around to the front. But I do keep driving forward and take multiple penetration steps. And I do eventually finish in really good position on top. So overall, I'll give myself a 3.5 out of 5 for this takedown. So my total score for the 3 takedowns would have been 10.5 out of 15, which I would mark in the good range, but not the excelling range, and could definitely use some work. The most common mistake that I had made was not having my foot placement in between my opponent's feet. So if I was a coach looking at this, I would definitely work in practice to make sure that my penetration steps were occurring in between my opponent's feet. Overall, not bad, but definitely could use some work. Just to recap what we talked about in the video, so the first section was mainly the general description of the penetration step or shot in wrestling, just describing the general movements of the entire body while taking a shot. Then I moved on and described in greater detail, more specifically, the right leg extremity and all the specific muscle movements, agonists, antagonists, and synergists that go into every different movement while performing a penetration step. And then the third part were the practice cues and things to look for while performing a shot in an actual match. I looked at myself and graded myself on 3 different shots that I took in an actual season. And I definitely had some things to work on. But overall, I would say that the shot is one of the more essential movements and most basic movements to set up for leg attacks, and it's definitely one of the most common in the sport of wrestling. Just some references that I used to make this presentation. I used an article called Lower Limb Joint Kinetics in the Starting Blocks in First Stance in Athletic Sprinting by the Journal of Sports Sciences. I used 3 of Dr. Heima's PowerPoints just to refer to the different muscle movements that each muscle would make and the different synergists and antagonists. And then I also used 2 videos, one by Adam Wheeler, which was just the wrestling basics of the penetration step, and also a video by East Bay, which featured Jordan Burroughs, and it was basically the wrestling basics and fundamentals of takedowns. And then finally, I used an article from the Sports Biomechanics, and it was titled Effects of Workload and Pedaling Cadence on Knee Forces in Competitive Cyclists.